Welcome to Business at the Speed of Coffee, the one television show for business, by business, about business. You can't go very far in New Zealand without a debate appearing about public policy, be it climate change, be it roading or transport or trade. Sitting behind these debates is information, knowledge and policy. There was an organisation a number of years ago which was very prominent in this debate. It was called the Business Roundtable. I guess out of the ashes of that organisation appeared another organisation called the New Zealand Initiative. Let's call it a think tank. And to run that organisation, they recruited a prominent social scientist from Europe. His name is Dr. Oliver Hartwich. Welcome, Dr. Oliver Hartwich, to Business at the Speed of Coffee.
Great to be on the programme.
So you hail from Western Europe. So tell us where it all began.
Oh, it all begins for me in Germany. I was born in a place called Gelsenkirchen. That's part of the Ruhr area. It's an old industrial powerhouse of Germany, but it's been in decline since the 1950s when German coal became uncompetitive. And I was born there in the 70s. That's where I grew up, went to school, went to university, and I studied economics. This whole region is really confusing, actually, because it's a place of about 5.5 million people, and nobody's ever heard of it because it is actually split into 52 council areas, and for some historical reasons they never merged.
Okay.
But it's actually bigger than Berlin. It's about 3 times the size of Munich, but nobody has ever heard of it.
So it was an industrial city, if you like? Or?
Yes.
Okay.
So basically this
German
region,
Rust Belt.
Yeah, roughly. So when the industrialization took off in Germany in the 19th century, all of these old villages and little towns grew and grew and grew until they reached each other's borders, and so they actually formed one effective big city, the Ruhr metropolis. But as I said, they never merged. They stayed in their old borders, and therefore you've got places like Gelsenkirchen and Bochum and Essen and Oberhausen and Mülheim and Duisburg. So nobody's ever heard of these places, but jointly they're actually Germany's biggest city.
Were you a bright student?
Yeah, I think that's fair to say.
So you went to the Prüfung, I think they had, and went the bright stream. At what stage did you think a period in academia was the good idea?
Wow. I was actually considering a career in academia, and it didn't really happen for me. I would have probably stayed in the university system had it been possible. I did something really strange. I studied economics. I didn't actually like it that much at the time. The dismal science, but also I thought it was just too theoretical, too mathematical for my taste, and I didn't really appreciate it at the time, and I didn't like it. And so what I did was I escaped and I did a law PhD.
Oh, good heavens.
Yes, it was a law and economics PhD.
Yeah.
It was related, and I thought, actually, the combination is probably not too bad. So I was 28 when I finished my PhD. So I had a law PhD, but no law undergraduate, so I had an economics master's. And then I thought, okay, maybe I'll stay in university. And then my PhD supervisor said, well, actually, it doesn't really work that way, because you still have to do a bar exam if you want to do it in the law faculty. You have to do a habilitation, and you have to do basically an apprenticeship in the German court system. So by the time you finished all of this, you'll be 40. And I thought, well, okay, maybe not. Or I could have gone back to the economics faculty, do another PhD there, do another habilitation, and I would have also been 40 to start my career, and I thought, okay, I'm leaving.
So then, how did you get into this public policy business?
Well, I was always interested in public policy and politics, and I always wanted to work there. And for very private reasons, I wanted to move to London because I had a long-distance relationship at the time with my Australian girlfriend.
Aha!
So London was the compromise. It was English-speaking and it was European. It was easy for her to get a visa, and I didn't need one at the time because they were still part of the EU.
Yeah.
That's all changing.
Yes.
So I ended up in London. I found a job in the House of Lords. I worked as an assistant to one of the peers, and then afterwards I managed to get into a think tank.
So you end up in the House of Lords. So by this stage, English, was it a second language for you? I mean, your English is obviously vernacular now. Was that from school, or where did that come from?
I had an excellent English teacher at school,
Okay.
Frau Voss. She was brilliant. She was very Anglophile. She gave me this lifelong passion for anything England-related. I had studied in Australia for my PhD, also to be with my girlfriend. So
there's a pattern emerging here.
Yeah, there is a bit of a pattern. So my English was passable, I would say.
Yeah.
And I got this job in the Lords, and that was just eye-opening to see how politics works in practice, and I really enjoyed it.
What was your impression of the British Westminster system of democracy?
Fascinating, just fascinating, seeing the Palace of Westminster, first of all, as a building and how confusing it is, and it is so easy to get lost. Yeah. And then seeing politics in practice. Because when you study economics, you do public choice and you kind of learn how this works in theory. In practice, you'll find some of that. I had one really eye-opening scene that I remember. I sat in the Grand Committee of the House of Lords with my peer just behind my lord. Yeah. And he got up and he congratulated a baroness from the other side and said, what a great statement she made, and the policies all made sense. And I thought, hang on, this is the opposite of what we believe in. So he sat down, turned around to me and said, that was all a bunch of nonsense, but we need her later. So I thought, okay, this is how politics works.
Politics of accommodation. Yeah.
Correct. So I learned a lot, just the practicalities of how Parliament works, and it was just fascinating.
Do you think it's robust enough to deal with the ruptures that Boris Johnson is delivering to the British people?
I actually don't think Boris Johnson is delivering much of a fracture to British politics. That was all there before him.
So he inherited it?
He inherited a mess. He inherited a mess on many fronts, actually. The decision to take away the right to dissolve Parliament from the Prime Minister and have a fixed term act, that was David Cameron. Yeah. The decision to call the referendum was David Cameron. The initial negotiations with the European Union after the Brexit referendum, that was Theresa May. So Boris Johnson inherited a complete mess, and I think he's actually doing a relatively good job, actually, with that mess.
And how long did you work around Westminster?
Well, I worked in the House of Lords for about 8-9 months, and then afterwards I got myself a job in a think tank. I was in Westminster called Policy Exchange. I had never heard of them before, and they were quite young. They were only 2 years old at the time. And this think tank turned out to be very closely linked to a certain group of Tory MPs, some backbenchers that people had never heard of before, like David Cameron and George Osborne. So suddenly I was in that group. And then 2005, when I worked there, the Tories lost their third election to Tony Blair. Mm-hmm. And out of nowhere came this David Cameron, and he delivered 2 speeches to launch his campaign for the party leadership in our small office in Westminster. I was there.
Now, these guys are Tories. Yes. You'd have to say on the more conservative side of the spectrum. Has that dragged you into that, or are you agnostic when it comes to being left or right thinking?
Well, at Policy Exchange, I must say, I always felt like the classical liberal sleeper.
Okay.
So I had very distinct views, and I think I was always a classical liberal. But at Policy Exchange, you're right. They were more on the conservative side, and I didn't share all my philosophies. And there were some things that we were not allowed to talk about at the time. Ironically, we were not allowed to talk about Europe.
Oh, really?
There was this understanding that really came down from David Cameron to the whole party that actually you just don't talk about the EU because the moment you start talking about Europe, it will rip the party apart and it will just be a complete disaster. And how right he was.
He was, yeah.
So I held some views basically to myself, but I worked on others, and that was good fun.
So let's fast forward a bit. So you're now deeply entrenched in public policy, no doubt about that, and presumably some research being done. How on earth does that morph into coming to New Zealand and running another think tank?
Well, actually, via a detour, because after London, we first moved to Sydney.
Okay.
So I had already studied in Sydney for a while for my PhD. So I knew the place, and my wife and I, after 4.5 years in London, we decided we wanted to have a family eventually, and London didn't feel right for that. Mm-hmm. So ironically, she was keen on Berlin, and I was keen on Sydney. And we were relatively indifferent which place it would be, but we wanted to get out of London, just for purely personal reasons. And I applied for jobs in both places, and I had actually job offers from both places, but the most interesting one came from Sydney. So I moved to the Centre for Independent Studies.
Oh, because they're very influential, yes, of course.
For 3.5 years. And that was also quite a liberation for me, because finally I was able to talk about Europe. Mm. And that coincided with the Greek debt crisis and the Euro debt crisis, so I became a columnist and commentator on the Euro debt crisis, because hardly anyone followed it in Sydney. So that was great fun. So I worked on public policy in Australia, and then after the demise of the Business Roundtable and the New Zealand Institute, when they both tried to form a merger, I was contacted whether I could imagine leading a think tank in New Zealand, and leading a think tank sounded great, except I knew next to nothing about New Zealand, I must admit.
So now you got the job in Wellington, I presume.
Yes.
Okay. Was it something of a shock moving to Wellington. I don't want to be too patronising about Wellington, but it isn't Sydney.
Well, I imagined it might have been a shock because all the previous places in which I lived, first the Ruhr, then London, then Sydney, were at least 5 million people.
Yeah, exactly.
So initially I thought, would I feel claustrophobic in Wellington? But I can tell you that I've been there for 7.5 years and I've never had a better quality of life, so I'm really happy.
Oh, that's great. You got used to the weather.
Actually, the weather is way better than Sydney for my taste. I was born for the German climate and Wellington comes close.
Yeah, there you go. Great plug for the city. So let's talk about the New Zealand Initiative. Can you tell us exactly what it looks like and how it operates?
Okay, the New Zealand Initiative is a hybrid organisation. We are a think tank, as you mentioned earlier. That means we're developing public policy. We're writing reports, we're writing articles, we're commenting in the media on a broad array of issues. So from education to housing to social policy, we even did fisheries management for a while. So we basically try to consult the public and government and opposition.
Is that funded research?
No, it is not funded research. It is a membership organization because that's the other part of the hybrid. So we are a think tank, but we are also a membership organization. We're bringing together currently about 60 to 70 companies. They're paying an annual membership fee, and out of this pool of funding, we pay all our research, but we're not doing any commissioned research.
I'd like for you to clarify something that is now gaining tremendous traction in the United States. This question of high net worth people, like the Koch brothers in the US, putting billions into all kinds of these NGOs and making them look like they're independent, but actually have very long and deep agendas. Could that criticism be aimed at the New Zealand Initiative?
It would be nice because it would mean that we would have more funding. We don't have that. We are very transparent about our funding structures. So for the large companies in our organization, they pay an annual subscription rate of $45,000. And we've got discounts for smaller sized companies. It would be nice to have some billionaires in the background boosting
but driving
our budget.
the agenda.
Well, the thing is actually, we are not in this category, so I don't have to defend myself here.
Good.
But I'm happy to defend the American think tanks because I think when you're engaging with their funding structure, I think you're missing the point. Why don't you engage with the arguments? If they're producing shoddy research and they're not making good arguments, other people will pull it apart. If the only thing you can pull apart is their funding structure, there must be something right about their arguments.
The only thing is, I think there might be an imbalance of the funding streams. That's the only thing. But coming back to the initiative, let's talk about some of the recent work that you've done, because many of those topics I think are very current in what needs to be discussed here in New Zealand. So let's talk about some of those streams.
Okay. Well, maybe start with a belief that I've held for a long time, and that is localism. We already touched on it. The one thing that really shocked me about New Zealand coming here was the degree of centralisation. So we've got a country here, basically the size of Italy, population a bit lower, of course, but with a government that is centralised like no other country in the world.
Soviet Union, perhaps.
90% of government spending and taxation, obviously, is controlled by Wellington. And as I said, this is a geographically large country. I think actually sometimes it is better to have local solutions to local problems, and Wellington can be quite far away in a country of our size. And actually, New Zealand is quite a diverse country. So the problems in Auckland are different from the problems in Wellington, different from the problems in Westland and Fiordland and South.
So do you think a bureaucrat in Wellington should be solving our transport problems up Dominion Road?
Well, obviously not. I think it would be far better to have local people making their own local choices and local decisions. But apart from that, I think what I really don't like about the system is that it also concentrates the finances in Wellington. The thing is actually, imagine you're the mayor of Auckland, and it comes to housing, and Auckland needs housing. Well, the choice you have to make here is you have to build the roads, you have to provide the infrastructure, you have to deal with the neighbors who don't like the development. You're creating more pressure on public services. And as a thank you, all the taxes generated out of this flow to Wellington. Well, that can't be right. So you've got nothing to offer to your local population out of this development. I think we should turn this around. We should actually give locals an incentive to go for it and say, well, there's something in it for us, and this development pays.
That's precisely what happens in Western Europe, most of Western Europe anyway, Germany, Belgium and so on.
That happens in Germany, that happens even better, I think, in Switzerland. And these are the two countries that have managed to keep their house prices more or less stable in real terms since the 1970s. Whereas we all know what happened to our house prices. Our house prices have spiraled out of control. I think the reason why they have is because we have this mismatch in incentives when it comes to house building.
Yeah, precisely. The productivity is another topic that's front of mind. We've been flatlining for years, and I've heard a lot of excuses. If you were to produce let's say, a recipe or a blueprint of things for New Zealand to do to increase productivity, what might be on that list?
Well, first of all, let me just reiterate, our productivity performance in New Zealand is abysmally bad and has been for decades. And in a way that is hard to understand because we have this productivity paradox, you know, what economists call the productivity paradox. So our institutions are actually fundamentally okay. I mean, they could be better, but compared to the whole rest of the world, we're doing all right. So we should be 20% richer on a per capita basis than the OECD. In fact, we're 20% behind. So it has always been difficult to explain what's going on here. But I think when you look at our policy settings, what you can find is that there are some areas of public policy in New Zealand where we're simply not doing a good enough job. And just to give you a few examples, first of all, I think this mismatch in funding when it comes to development, which we just talked about. On top of that, I think we've got among the most restrictive foreign direct investment regulations. So we make it really hard for capital to come to this country, when actually capital coming into this country would solve a lot of our problems, would connect us better to international markets, for example. We have problems not just when it comes to the fiscal side of development, but also the regulatory side. The IMA, a complete disaster. How old is it now? 26, 27 years. It's been reformed.
Millions of patches on it.
Exactly. So it's been reformed almost every year. So, I mean, how many times do you have to go through this process until you realize that this is a terrible piece of legislation and we start again?
Yes. I mean, it doesn't work as an environmental legislation, and it certainly doesn't work for business.
So there are many
But of course,
issues.
there are a lot of vested interests that like it, because for the environmental lawyers, it's a gravy train that, gift that keeps on giving. So
of course.
Yeah, but
I think we're not running this
so
government
what I'm
to keep
hearing
the lawyers
is capital
happy.
movement's a problem, planning systems need reform, some kind of funding, the way the funding goes to local bodies and so on.
And one more thing. Education. Don't underestimate education. In the long run, of course, we know that productivity is everything. But I think in the long run, being educated enough to be productive is almost as important.
Well, we've got this ridiculous situation that polytechs and so on are going broke. Can't get enough kids to go into them, and they had to rely on foreigners to fund them. Now that seems to be over. I kind of like the European model where people are streamed, aren't they? Well,
we can talk about vocational training.
Yes.
And I'm a great believer in the dual education system that countries like Germany and Switzerland and Denmark practice. And it is basically taking people out of school and having them at vocational training schools, but also at employers. So spending their time 2 days in a school and 3 days in a factory, and learning the skills in a practical way while getting also some theoretical education. But I think the problems with the education system, they begin a lot earlier. We should be talking about what's happening in our primary and secondary schools. So in the tertiary thing, that happens later. But I'll just give you a couple of data here. The Tertiary Education Commission came to the conclusion a few years ago in a survey that about 40% of our NCA Level 2 graduates, after 12 years of education, are functionally illiterate and innumerate.
I hear 20%.
40.
40%.
40. And this is just a scandal, because how can you go to school for 12 years where we as taxpayers spend $130,000 on your education and you leave school and you can't write, read or calculate?
Is that because the teachers, I mean, it's tough to say that teachers are incompetent, so it must be the curriculum itself is failing them, or?
I think we've got a massive problem with the curriculum, because the curriculum is relatively vacuous in New Zealand. We have a very generalized curriculum and then leave it to schools to decide what they really want to teach.
Is that smart?
It is not smart. We also have an assessment system in NCA which I think is failing us. So you currently have about 9,000 courses to choose from when it comes to doing your NCA credits.
9,000? Most people wouldn't be aware of it.
Well, you can get NCA credits for preparing a microwave dish. And I think that is not the purpose of school. The purpose of school is actually prepare us in the basic skills we need for life. Writing, reading, numeracy, I think history also.
Well, so in other words, the framework for producing a curriculum obviously needs some examination. And of course, we're going to see a fault line appearing about studying history. I can see that coming, because everyone's going to have a different view of what should go in there. And one wonders how that curriculum is going to be developed.
But you know what? in a way that is a good debate to have, because
Yes.
it's the first time that we're actually deciding at a national level what we would like to have in the curriculum. We're doing it for history now, and I can see the controversies coming.
Yes.
But we should have exactly the same discussion about all the other subjects taught at school. So why is it that we have no prescriptive curriculum for mathematics, for example? Why do we leave it to schools to make up what they really want to teach?
So, but was there the national standard got removed because they said that was causing anxiety for the children? Is that right?
Yeah, well, it's a separate issue.
Yeah.
This curriculum has been with us for more than 20 years.
Yes.
It was celebrated at the time when it was introduced as a world first, because it was so general and really left a lot to interpretation at the local level. But after 20 years, and in combination with the NCA assessment system,
Hasn't worked.
it hasn't worked. And you can see it. You can see it in the figures that I just quoted.
Yeah.
You can see it in our international performance when it comes to PISA, TIMSS, PEARLS, all of these international testing. They're showing us on a downward slope.
The way policy gets debated in New Zealand and the policy development and finally the way the political system works, we've now got MMP.
Which is German.
German idea.
Sorry about that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, they didn't like the politicians, so they got rid of the political system, basically. But from your looking at it from a distance, how do you feel our electoral system is working, say relative to others you've looked at?
Well, I'm not a fan of MMP.
Okay.
You know, after 70 years of MMP operating in Germany, even half the Germans still don't understand how it works.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not sure whether they are systematically less intelligent than New Zealanders, but I would assume that even New Zealanders sometimes get confused about MMP.
Yeah.
What I don't like about MMP is that it leaves everything to post-election negotiations.
Yes.
You never really have a complete choice where you've got the government against the opposition. They both tell you what they want to do, and after the election you get one side.
Yeah. One of the great debates around the world today, which is being made more interesting with a character like Donald Trump in the White House, is this question about climate change. And we've now got a climate change commission coming and so on. And I've studied a lot of this stuff, and I'm not sure that I think that anyone's got the policy settings or even proposals correct. Can you walk us through a little bit of the work that you've done and where you're landing on this?
Okay, the way I'm thinking about climate change is obvious. It is an issue. It is a problem that we need to address.
Yeah.
Where I would probably wish for a bit more nuance in the debate is just to realize that it's just one of many issues that we have to deal with globally. So the United Nations, of course, passed the Sustainable Development Goals a few years ago. And we're talking about 17 different goals, you know, access to sanitation, spreading education, all of these
Drinking
issues.
water and so
Drinking,
forth.
all of this. Really important issues for a lot of people, for hundreds of millions of people around the world. Climate change is one of them. And I think this is where my policy response to climate change would be, to make sure that New Zealand is properly integrated into global efforts to deal with climate change. And that means, for example, playing a part in international carbon trading markets. So what you should do instead is you should set a carbon price, you should let the market actually deal with carbon emissions, and let the market also figure out what kind of industrial structure New Zealand needs. I think it is irresponsible to pretend that New Zealand can solve climate change just domestically.
You know, we've discussed public policy in some depth and are very interested in it. How do you feel about the fact that maybe 30% of the population actually have a vote?
If only 30% vote in local elections and maybe 50-60% vote in national elections, maybe that's not such a bad thing if only the most informed voters come out. But no, to be honest, it is sometimes frustrating. You're working on policies, you're thinking deeply about them, but then you realize every election, it is not policies that drive people to vote.
It's personalities often.
It is personalities. I mean, look at New Zealand's last election. Regardless where you stand on Labour or National or any of the parties or any of the issues, but the Labour Party changed the leader. They didn't change any of the policies, and that made a difference of about 15 percentage points.
Yes.
Well, okay, so we have a personality election. It is not an election where people actually vote for the political preferences. It is where they vote for people, and for people like us working in policy, developing great new ideas, that can be a bit
depressing.
frustrating.
Yes. Well, and look, and that's played out certainly in the United States, as we know, to what is of some concern. And of course now we've got this coalition arrangement where it would appear that if people thought they were voting for Labour, who aren't actually running the country, on most of the major decisions, it seemed to me, it's actually the minority members of the coalition that are actually driving the agenda.
Well, no, that's a function of MMP, which is why I've always preferred a first-past-the-post system. I've seen the operations of MMP in Germany, because Germany's been operating under it for 70 years, not just at the federal level, but at the state level too. And you see the weirdest coalitions and the weirdest policy initiatives taken after elections, where sometimes I wish we just had a clear choice between two parties basically competing for the best ideas, and then every now and then we just swap them.
Yeah. Well, I think probably the message for our viewers is that actually get out there and vote. And probably would the result be different if we got, say, 90% of the people voting?
Well, look at Australia. I mean, they've got compulsory voting, and you're fine if you're not. I'm not sure whether that makes a great difference.
To the outcome in the end.
The thing is, actually, people are rationally uninformed, as we say in economics. Because actually, for the individual voter, it doesn't really make much sense to spend any time reading newspapers, spending any money on magazines or reading books, because in the end, your vote doesn't make a difference. You're not deciding the outcome of the election with your vote, so why would you spend any time or money talking or thinking about politics?
Which is a cynical view, an unfortunate one.
Which is unfortunately the realistic view, but I mean, we've got colleagues in the office with whom we discuss this regularly because they refuse to vote because it doesn't make a difference. Then it only encourages them. So I take a different view. I'm taking a more democratically romantic view. I think it is a civic duty to vote because many people around the world don't have the privilege of doing that. And I think it would be morally unfair to them to not exercise your right when they are fighting for it.
I've never heard a more eloquent way of expressing what the franchise mean. Thank you for being on Business at the Speed of Coffee.
Thank you.